long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, dark times were ahead for the Bards. May the 4th was fast approaching, and only 2 of them had any interest in Star Wars. Joined by podcast alumnus Steven, and their game master for this session, Larry, Will and Ian explore the edge of the Empire. Will they be able to record a podcast episode without Chris and Brooke? Will Ian get tired of this voice? He will. Welcome to Dancing with the Bards. We have an unusual episode today. The parts of Brooke and Chris will be played by Steven.
Hello.
And Larry.
Hello.
Our game today is called Edge of the Empire, a Star Wars Legends role-playing game set in between episodes 4 and 5. This game was published in 2013 by Fantasy Flight Games, and is one of 3 standalone games that explore the Star Wars universe. With that, let's get started. So for your number of players, 4 to 6, my favorite number for number of players for a tabletop game.
It does seem pretty standard, and it does go well. It lends itself to having about 3 to 5 active players in a session along with a game master.
I would agree with that. I think that as far as tabletop games go, it is a very standard number. It's a very comfortable number. I think it's a lot of groups that get together kind of anticipate that kind of thing.
I was asked on Twitter a couple days ago my favorite, my ideal number for a group for D&D, and usually that applies to most role-playing games. I said 5, and this is that sweet spot. After you get like 7 or 8, it just becomes way too much, and 2 and 3 is
sad.
Yeah, a little bit.
I mean, I personally like large groups. I prefer between 6 and 7 players. It allows for a lot more group interactivity. Individual players can split off more often and do side things, but that's not for everybody, and I can completely understand that.
To a certain extent, it is what the expectations of the people in the group are, and what they're looking to get out of it. So yeah, I suppose you could be more flexible with it. I personally think that I'm kind of in Ian's camp on this one with it, but I don't know what the rest of you gave it. I ended up giving it a 2 for number of players. And again, well, I think that that's a comfortable number of players. It's kind of the standard. So I wouldn't be giving it a 3 unless it were better than standard, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I ended up giving it a 2 as well, for the above reasons.
I mean, I ended up leaning into the 3 in regards to that, just because it's a very standard, uniform number. It doesn't really require any sort of extra people that wouldn't normally be part of your group, and it's a good enough number that for most role-playing groups, everyone can be included.
Yeah, that's a 3 for me as well. I as I said, it's my sweet spot. 4 to 6 is right there at 5, so ideal number. And as far as accessibility, you can buy this game on their website. If you want to go for a beginner's kit, which includes a small rulebook, standard adventure, a set of dice, it's about $30. The core rulebook, if you want to kind of make your own adventures, $60, and they have other stuff too.
Now, looking at it from accessibility, I don't come at these things from a perspective that some people have, where they are in a group of people that typically have trouble accessing these things. But no, just looking at it, I think that the size of the rulebook and the amount of printed material is going to be a big turnoff for people for whom reading is an issue. That's kind of a general criticism of a lot of TTRPGs, though, so it's not necessarily specific to this one. The rulebook does have some visuals to help support the comprehension, but not nearly enough to make a huge difference.
I personally actually rated it pretty low in terms of accessibility, just because of the amount that if you're a group that has been playing it for a while, it's a very smooth operating game, but when you're first coming into it, it can be very, very daunting. There's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of different factors. I mean, even when we played ourselves today, we ended up cutting 1 or 2 of the factors of gameplay from it, just so this way we can condense it and it wouldn't be too overwhelming for new players.
And I think on that topic, just the fact that you're able to so easily remove elements of gameplay, that was one of the reasons I was able to give it an extra point there. I feel like if you're able to remove specific elements of gameplay that aren't necessarily detrimental to the ultimate story being told or the potential challenge that the players might feel, I don't necessarily think that's a detriment. It's just like Monopoly. You know, the more skilled you become with the game, the more rules you can add, and you can play around with different house rules and that sort of stuff. I think that's personally a good thing, and I ended up rating it a 2 because of that.
Yeah, I also agree with the fact that it's not just about how easy it is to get; it is also about how hard it is to read. I gave it a 2 as well because while it is, as I said, it is easy to get. It's not easy to get, if you know what I mean.
My experience, it's kind of up there with most TTRPGs of its scope, so it's hasn't really done anything to really improve on the formula. Doesn't do anything particularly bad, although we're going to talk about the dice. I think that's more of a materials discussion. But in terms of accessibility, the one feature of the dice are their colors, and I will note that the sheet right here specifically calls out colorblindness as now an issue. I'm not certain if the brightly colored dice would be easy to confuse for somebody who doesn't see colors the same as we do.
I will say I am colorblind myself, and I mean we were using an app, so I can't speak for the dice provided themselves, but really once I was able to get past that, it was two basic shapes, and it was of two separate color types. It was not very difficult. That being said, I have red-green color blindness. Somebody with a different form of color blindness might not, fare so well. But it wasn't too bad, and it's not like it's constantly referenced in the rule books, unless it is.
No, it really isn't, and that also brings up the fact, too, when it comes down to the rulebook and the dice in the rulebook, as a fair warning, they only show a picture of the die. So there are 2 D6s, 2 D8s, a D12, and a D20. So with that, when 1 D6 is white and 1 D6 is black, yeah, there's a stark difference, but it could still be an issue.
There's also a D4, right?
No,
Isn't there?
no, that's still a D8.
Oh, I was looking at the picture. Yeah.
Yeah, they look like D4s, I'll admit. It's just the triangle is the one face of the die.
Yeah, they just cut off the rest of the die.
Now, green versus purple, yellow versus red, white versus black, blue versus also black. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd still be paired up with black.
Thankfully, they have different symbols on the sides.
And I think that's a big saving grace. Is they are customized and unique symbols. It's not tied to a specific color of a die. You could get, monochromatic dice made that are just the symbols, and they would function the same way.
I mean, since we're on the topic, let's just switch over to materials. We'll go back to comprehension.
Yeah.
Honestly, I thought that would be a really good lead-in to comprehension, because it's one point you could bring up for that. Because these are symbols invented for the game. They're something that you have to learn specific for this game. And that, I think, is a hit to comprehension.
And I completely agree. I think the dice are one of the biggest turnoffs. I think 3 or 4 times throughout the campaign, I had to ask how the dice worked the same time, like for the same set of skills. Maybe if I had physical dice, I could associate it better, but I gotta be honest, it was a little confusing. Am I doing the green triangles, or am I doing the yellow pentagrams for these? And I ultimately was just like, what dice do I roll? Tell me, Mr. Game Master.
I mean, I don't like the dice system. It's always been one of my favorite features and one of my least favorite features about the game, because it's a very different idea. I mean, one of my biggest turnoffs of D&D is the fact that it runs on a multi-dice D20 system, and it's always been a huge turnoff for me because of all of the different dice you need to have. Now, while this has the same thing, it feels like these dice serve a better purpose. And once you're able to start associating the symbols with said dice, it becomes a lot easier to understand. So I actually ended up giving it a 2 in comprehension because of that.
Now, I will agree with Larry's estimation of the dice. One of the things that I find most Now, granted, I'm a math teacher, but if you look at the D&D dice system, a 1 and a 20 are equally likely, and just as likely as any other result on a D20. So the randomization as a flat thing has always kind of bothered me in D&D. Just like it feels like there shouldn't be that much variability. Your more often than not, your results should be kind of average, and with very unlikely and very likely things happening much more rarely. So this dice system works a little bit more off of the success type system, which you find in a lot of the Life Wolves games, and where you're rolling multiple dice and then looking for successes, failures, etc. That's essentially the core of the dice system, and I prefer that type of dice system to the the normal numeric system. I do like it from that perspective, kind of what you're bringing up there, and I agree that once you get into it, it's very easy to go. And in terms of the dice having a purpose, I would agree with that as well, because you don't need to know, like, this weapon does this damage die kind of thing, or you're never going to use a d4 unless you're doing this one specific thing. That they're always being used. They always have a purpose, and they come up in just about every check.
Yeah.
But kind of veering from the dice a little bit, I know that, and this is maybe information that's 5+ years old at this point, but I remember when I was actually reading the book, the certain core concepts of the game, I'll just pull out skills for that matter, weren't clearly explained. I don't think that they were totally clear on exactly what certain skills did or when exactly you were supposed to use them instead of another skill. And that was one thing that I, as kind of a rules lawyer, found as a bit of a turnoff, where not everything in the rules was totally well explained. Now, that does open the door for different tables to use different interpretations. I got a feel for how Larry interpreted things in this session, and now I thought that the way that he kind of divvied it up was pretty clear. I like that. You did a good job there.
Yeah.
But that's something that I thought was also a hit to comprehension.
I honestly, I agree with you on this. And that's something I wanted to bring up was the system for character creation and playing requires a lot less math than a lot of the dice-based systems like Call of Cthulhu or Dungeons & Dragons. On the same level, it requires a lot more reading, especially when it comes to things like the skills. They have giant skill trees where you can basically buy up these things with points very quickly, and whereas with things like Dungeons & Dragons, where you acquire those skills over a long period of time, and you have a lot of time to kind of play with them and see how they work for you, it's a lot more varied character to character in this game, to the point where I could see someone having a really hard time remembering what skills they have, what they don't, because they give you a very small portion of this character sheet to write down some very complicated skills.
I gotta be honest, I think I skipped over a huge portion of what my splicer feats were, because I got bonuses to those black dies, like, from the skills I had. I think I got 2 more of them, or 2 less of them, or I just didn't use them. I was just like, I'm not gonna worry about this unless someone calls me on it.
It almost feels like you need a separate sheet apart from your character sheet to keep track of all of your different feats and talents, which in the book, it's nice how they kind of put it where they have almost like the skill tree, and then there's like a box you can check off. However, unless everybody buys their own copy of the rule book, that's functionally useless, or you could scan the image and give it to the player. So there's ways around it that weren't immediately obvious, so to speak, with something like that. So this way you can actually keep track of those sorts of things. And that's something I'm kind of thinking about in retrospect now.
I think that, no, I see exactly where you're coming from that. And that is just kind of further justification to me that this game takes kind of a hit on materials. Every TTRPG that I'm aware of has some form of character sheet. And this one, I think, is a decent one from a minimalist perspective. It's relatively easy to find and record information on it. But I think that given your talents, as they're called in this game, are a very big part of character building and progression, the way that this system handles it is not very good. That's not a good way to keep track of them on your character sheet. So it could have had a better designed character sheet from that perspective. And then, of course, the dice.
Yeah, well,
Well, I think with the character sheet, at least, they wanted to try and keep it as clean as possible. I mean, without a doubt, this game gets a 1 in materials from me just because, like I said, the dice is always my favorite and least favorite feature. But even with the character sheet, I appreciate how clean it is. I do not like how minimalist it is. It's almost like you need an entire separate section to keep track of everything that's not a base skill.
Moving into gameplay then.
Mhm.
Setup.
Basically none.
I mean, for this session, we were fortunate. Larry put a lot of time into this, and the character creation, especially if you use a lot of the supplements, can be a absolute nightmare. If I remember correctly, when we did this together.
Yes. So when I ran a previous full-length campaign of this, it was about 2 to 3 hours a person for character creation. Just because there's so many options and the options are so vast. I mean, obviously you can limit that by not having any additional supplements, but if you have someone who's a big fan of the lore, they're going to be like, oh, well, why can't I be this specific odd class of bounty hunter from this rim world that was mentioned once in a comic in 1974? You know, so that stuff is there, and when you get into character creation, it ends up taking a lot longer. So that, along with, especially from a GM's perspective, thinking of what checks to use where, it's not as apparent in most games where, you know, in D&D, it'd be like, oh, well, there's a tree, that's obviously a nature check. Something like this, if you want to talk to somebody and you want to try and, like, coerce them into doing something, there's 3 different options you can go with. There's your streetwise, there's your base cunning stat, and then your skullduggery stat on top of that. All 3 of those are functionally the same thing, depending on who you're talking to.
Kind of going back to what I said earlier about the game not clearly differentiating certain concepts from each other. But
I mean, but I feel like even in D&D, it's similar with making what am I thinking of?
it's a good question.
The various charisma checks. There are a number of
Persuasion, deception, those kind of things.
Oh yeah, no, those are way more. Yeah.
Yeah, they're a lot more clearly defined.
Oh, I wasn't sure what you were talking about.
Yeah, no, I guess they are a little bit more clearly defined. My apologies.
I mean, I think some of what I see in this game, at least, like if I assume that these cover the same things that the D&D skills do, it becomes clearer there. Like charm is a persuasion analog, and what was it, coercion? Oh shit, never mind. I've just proved myself wrong.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is they're all pretty much analogs of each other, and if you, I mean, this is a modified D20 system. At the end of the day, it's
Is it though?
it really feels like it. It's got all of the, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck. It might not exactly be a duck, but it's some fowl.
I saw it as some variant of success-based system as opposed to a D20 system. In
Yeah,
fact,
I don't necessarily. I mean, the D20. That's not fair because that implies that it's. I'm thinking of the dice. I'm not. I'm really thinking of the way the stats.
okay, yeah,
and math work.
The way that the whole character process is based around is very similar to D&D. You have your core abilities, and then you have your more specific trained.
Yeah,
things.
exactly.
Your skills.
Your
Yeah,
skills.
It's I would say that that's something that we can bring up a little more when we talk about classic versus innovative.
One thing I wanted to ask Larry about for setup, because
Yeah.
I haven't read through this whole book. I've read bits and pieces. I have the general gist of how it works. How deep does this go into story creation?
In the core rulebook, it is hardly brushed upon. It's honestly highly recommended if you wanted to build your own campaign and all that. So there's a lot of fun little things that you'll get out of the core rulebook. You'll get a lot of different types of ships. You'll get a lot of different types of weapons, a lot of different types of enemies. There's a lot of things, but as far as world building goes, there's hardly anything in the core rulebook. Which is why if you were thinking about running your own campaign and you want like a little starter kind of deal, you're better off getting the beginner's kit and getting a feel for the gameplay before you actually jump into trying to do something on your own. Because as far as a starter adventure, what comes in the core rulebook is literally just you walk onto a space dock and you get onto a ship.
Yeah, I only bring it up because one of the biggest parts of setup for most of these games usually tends to be the part that no one really sees very often, except the person who runs it, is how much work did I put in to make this story happen? And I know they come with supplements for their own adventures, but I mean,
Yeah, that's why for setup, I was honestly tossing between a 1 and a 2, just because of the fact that I'm familiar with the system, so it wasn't as much of a struggle, and I'm familiar with the lore, so it wasn't as much of a struggle. But someone who's not, it's very, very bare bones what you actually get out of the core rulebook.
yeah. So for me, setup, I gave it a 1. I was a little critical, but I don't really think that critical, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as character creation goes, it isn't exactly epithet erased.
Don't get me started. We bring that. We also every recording session we bring up that game. It needs to happen at some point.
Well,
We
I'm
ever
glad
doing
that I
it
can
with
be.
Next session.
That I'm just saying, it's not the worst out there. It's definitely not the best, but it's not the worst.
Yeah.
It's Are we ready for rate of play?
I personally am, yeah.
I give it a 3 for rate of play. I think that this particular system doesn't have a lot of the in-game bloat that causes it to slow down a lot. Because I think that once you get into the dice checks, they're very consistent. It's always the same, essentially, formula whenever you build your checks, so you don't really have to worry about figuring out what's what. We never really ran into a circumstance where we had to keep track of all of our abilities, or at least we didn't. And we got through everything with more or less ingenuity and duct tape that we came with, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think that Larry did a good job of keeping things moving. It was clear cut enough and yet open enough for us to deal with it. But it's kind of like one of those things where the rate of play is going to somewhat be determined on the players and the GM themselves. That in any TTRPG, you'll get somebody like me who wants to say, DM, you're doing that wrong, and then leads to a half-hour argument about it.
I mean, that's part of the delay of the TTRPG is
Yeah.
getting to argue with the GM.
I try to limit that personally, but I know that it happens, and I'm not always the best about it. But so yeah, I'd say that as far as the system goes, it supports a good clip of play if you can, avoid the standard traps.
Yeah, it does seem to put a lot of power into the game master's hands, and I feel like for that reason, the pacing moves along very quickly. You don't really usually get caught up in a situation unless the players are stuck on what they want to do.
I mean, yeah, I agree. I did feel like at certain points, it did feel a little fast, but it might have been just a personal thing.
I know that some of us were also on the clock going like, come on.
Yeah, true that. Yeah. I enjoyed it. I gave it a 2 overall for rate of play. It was very enjoyable, and
Yeah. For rate of play, at least coming from like my perspective as the person who is running the game, I do really like that it's very open, but it's also very easy to railroad your players to be like, listen, this is what you should do, and this is how you're going to get it done. If you have any other ideas to do it, certainly go for it, but I feel like there's a very easy, overarching way that the skills work that there's not a lot of room for interpretation, in terms of at least like when you shouldn't use them.
Yeah, I gave it a 3 for rate of play. I felt it was pretty smooth overall.
So, quick discussion. Price.
The price for the core rulebook, it's about average. I'm personally not happy with it being $60.
Yeah,
but it's about average for a book its size.
Yeah, but on top of the
giant book.
I mean, on top of the core rule book, you're going to need dice per person to play.
Exactly.
Well, given how many of us just used a free app to kind of bypass that.
This is true.
You didn't hear that, Fantasy Flight.
Yeah, this is true.
It wasn't an illegal app, just a free one.
I mean, there are free options. I'm sure for the true experience of the game, dice in hand, it's going to cost some money for an investment in this, and I gave it a 1 because of that. This is definitely an investment and less of a game.
Yeah, the way that I looked at it, like, unlike, I know that, Larry, you definitely talked about how the book includes a lot, and world building really isn't one of those things. I know that kind of D&D is sort of the gold standard of TTRPGs, or at least kind of the World of Warcraft against whom everybody gets compared, regardless if they're better or worse.
Yeah.
But no, considering the material investment of the books themselves, I'd say that it's more or less equivalent. And I know that there's a lot of extra things that you'd want to pick up for both games. So I kind of gave it a 2 as kind of it's up there with most of the other options of its kind, so to speak.
On the topic of D&D being the source material, I do want to say D&D also does, to a certain extent, now kind of require you to buy a number of expansion books to get the full game. And it used to be, and I mean it's been this way for a while, but the player's handbook has gotten less and less. They've stopped releasing expansions to the player's handbook, and instead they've opted to just introduce races in newer source material. So after a while, I don't think it's a good thing. That's not what's on we're grading today.
One day.
One day when we're big.
I will say for
tackle
price,
that beast eventually.
I gave it a 2. As Larry said, it's a pretty standard price for tabletop game books. A standard that has definitely been set by Wizards of the Coast. Which, fun fact, this kind of game, Wizards of the Coast used to make a Star Wars RPG, and when they stopped making it, Fantasy Flight was like, oh, well, hey, Lucas, we'll make it for you. So I have to wonder if a lot of this isn't based on the fact that because it looks very similar to the Wizards of the Coast system, because I think it is meant to be similar to the Wizards of the Coast system.
Now, the Wizard of the Coast system, I will say, was a D20 system. I had played it prior, and I'm rather glad this one isn't, just because I've already made my opinions on D20 systems clear, I think.
Oh yeah, no, I just meant as far as like pricing and releasing various types of books,
also
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
They followed their guidelines for how they create content.
Shall we move on to community then?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So
I looked into this quite a bit. I was looking at various forums online. Games like this, where it's based off of a theme, like a
established IP.
Yeah, established IP. They tend to fade away pretty quick, especially when Disney comes around, buys the IP, and changes everything.
Well, yeah.
That had to come up in this discussion at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I brought it up in the stream as well, that this is no longer the official canon, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
which in a way is kind of fortunate because you can kind of do whatever you want to do with the setting.
Yeah, but as far as the community goes, I looked at the main Reddit channel, and I was like, oh, I see the best content or post was from 2 years ago. Let's refresh that. Or the newest posts, also 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was a flash in the pan for people who wanted to try out a new style of RPG. I mean, it's always going to have its dedicated fans,
Mm-hmm.
but those people aren't really interacting with the community anymore, so to speak.
The community is essentially kind of fizzled out. There are some forums where you can go and ask questions and look for groups to play with, and they post every few months, as far as I can tell. But as far as the main community, I gave it a 1 only because at one point this probably would have had a higher score, but it definitely hasn't had a continuous fan base like some other games do.
I have definitely heard people talk about Edge of the Empire, not just you, Ian, but it's always sort of the same thing, where it's like, oh, I used to play that, or I've heard about it. There's very little, it seems like, active interest in participating in a larger community like there are with some other TTRPGs, like you were saying. And again, yeah, I think it's a 1 for me too, dog.
Yeah, I also gave it a 1, unfortunately.
Extras. My goodness. If there were anyone to compete with 5th edition for extras, it might be Fantasy Flight Games.
Yes. 100% that got a 3 off the bat. Even if you go to their website now with a lot of out of print material, it's still just a absurdly long list of content, and that's not even delving into community support as well. I mean, as we said, the community died off, but all of those old files are still there. So all the people who, would upload their own homebrew styles or their own homebrew characters or anything like that, obviously people went rabid when they heard that there was a Star Wars RPG.
Mm-hmm. I'll list off what we got here. So multiple sets of dice, a GM kit, a beginner's kit, 8 rule supplement books, 3 adventure books, and there are also the 2 other games that I mentioned in the intro. The
Age of Rebellion.
Yeah, Age of Rebellion and the Force of Destiny. Which they're different games, they're separate games, but you can, in a story, move a character over from one to the other, and they have their own supplements. You could run a session like this for a very long time and keep a player for easily years for the content that they have available.
So we could talk about that totally more in replay value.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, enjoyment.
Oh, 3 for me all the way. I love this game.
Yeah, I've already fallen in love with this. This is it. And I'm not a huge Star Wars fan. Like I appreciate the IP. I watch the movies. I enjoy the memes. But like this is fun. This is really fun. I might not know all of the reference material, but at the same time, I can kind of, using context clues, understand what's going on, and yeah.
Now, I will say that, I really enjoyed the session we played today. I do want to talk briefly about the force point system that we cut for today's session.
Yes.
Not going to complain about that. The way that I understood it back when I played this years ago, I really liked some of the context there, where it seemed kind of, in one of its uses, it was a free-form way of the players to interact with the setting in a way that gave them a little bit more power over the setting than a traditional TTRPG allows. I remember just vividly one example, like, if you're inside in the middle of a firefight, you could spend a force point to find a convenient table to hide behind.
Yes.
And given that the setting is written with kind of theater of the mind in mind, then it allows the players to help flesh out the details of the setting and kind of take some of that burden off the GM to provide that information at their own whim.
Yeah, that's something that I also really enjoyed with it. Like I said, I wanted to cut it from this just because it felt like one more thing we would have to go over, and since it wasn't going to be a very combat-heavy scenario, I didn't think that we really run into any situations. I mean, it can be used outside of combat as well. So, like, let's say you're searching for some sort of key card to get into a building, you can find a convenient clue laying around, or something like that. It's almost like if you took the luck stat from a lot of different games and kind of gave it more of a purpose.
More flavor.
Yeah.
Than just, you lucked
Yeah,
out.
it's, did I roll good? It's not anything like that. It's more of a, and Call of Cthulhu does the same thing, where you'll get a static luck pool that you can pull from to adjust your values for what you rolled. And it's a little bit like that, but it's more of a group decision.
I also like the fact that the force point system flips between light and dark force side points, where the GM can use dark force side points in order to throw disadvantages or snags at the players, the same way the players can use light force side points to give themselves advantages or other things. And it was definitely designed to be a system that is dynamic, that you use fairly frequently, where the force points are continually changing back and forth between the two. So I thought that was an aspect of the system that I really did enjoy that just didn't get featured today. But again, I think that kind of playing at the rate of play and the breadth of the characters that you can make, I think it's really fun. I gave it a 3.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I think it's
I think
3s
we
all
really
around.
enjoyed this.
Yeah.
So does that mean everyone would also give it a 3 for recommendation?
No.
I also hit a speed bump there.
Yeah.
I gave it a 2. And I this is definitely a talking point I wanted to hit. Thank you, Ian. I would not recommend this to somebody who was not already pretty involved with the Star Wars IP. I enjoy tabletops, and I especially enjoy fantasy tabletops. I think I can get my fix from this game. If that weren't the case, I don't know how jazzed or enthused I would be on something like this. Like I stated earlier, I'm not super into. I'm not super into Star Wars, and I don't know if I would be super into this. I still think it's a great system. I still think that with the right group, a lot of people can get enjoyment out of this. But I don't think this is necessarily for everybody.
I think that if you were interested in a space sci-fi fantasy type adventure, this could definitely scratch that itch, whether or not you care all that much about Star Wars. However, I agree with you. I think that the people who would really enjoy this the most are people who are already drawn to the setting. And I think that kind of the game itself is built around that. So if you're not a Star Wars fan, you're not going to find a lot of what you want here.
Yeah, I also ended up rating it at a 2 because of that. Because if you enjoy the IP, or if you enjoy, even if you're looking for a different kind of system to run, you don't necessarily have to use all the Star Wars lore to run a session. But if you're not familiar with the system, or especially if you're going in blind as a whole group, I would not recommend trying to start this up. Like, I can only imagine the community when they first started, and the comprehension of the rule book, it could have just been an absolute lawless wasteland of interpretation.
Kind of was.
I did give it a 3. I personally would recommend this, mostly out of a personal wish to have more people to play it with.
I would say that if somebody can get into the game, I'm certain that they would enjoy it, could enjoy it, without necessarily caring about Star Wars. I do think that is a slight barrier to entry, and that people who don't care about Star Wars could easily find other things they're looking for elsewhere. However, thinking of our missing players right now, Brooke and Chris, while they were gracious enough to bow out and allow me a chance to be here, which I appreciate and thanks so much, I would say that you guys would enjoy this. I'm certain that if you were able to kind of get past some of the initial hurdles, you would have a good time with it. And the rest of you out there too.
Everybody else who listens. All 3 of you.
Hey man, we make it 5 out of
and
this.
Brazil.
And Brazil somehow.
Shout out to Brazil. And those 2 Aussies.
No, if only we'd recorded the hilarity of eating Japanese snacks beforehand, we'd get so many more views.
Oh, that will happen.
Yeah,
that's a really good call. And we could do 2 cuts. We could do a tasting and an ASMR session, because who doesn't want that?
I mean, we just have 2 separate mics.
Yeah,
We
exactly.
just cut one in and out.
But we're going on to replay value, I think, right now. I gave that a 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
3.
Oh, 100%.
So, I mean, from the GM's perspective, the amount of thought that goes into it does become a little exhausting. I really wanted to give it a 3 because I love this game to death, but I had to give it a 2 just because if you're not using a pre-built adventure, once again, going back to the accessibility, it can get a little tough. And it could get exhausting, especially running it session after session after session. From a player's perspective, this would have been a 4 out of 3 to me because of the setting, the way everything works, all that. But from the other side of that table, I would end up giving it a 2.
So you'd say it's probably a little unfair to the
It is
GM as opposed to the players enjoying it.
exactly.
Yeah, I understand that.
It's an interesting perspective, and I thank you for sharing that, because it's definitely something to consider as somebody who has been a GM, and I know that burnout is a real issue. Ian knows that burnout is a real issue.
Oh, I felt burnout hard.
So,
Same here.
As far as classic versus innovative, I gave this a 2 in classic. I feel that, and the reason being is because the system itself is unique to Fantasy Flight games, but it's their very much tried and true system.
Yeah, I ended up giving it a 1 over towards the innovative side because of that. Because yes, it's their system. All of their games use it. However, it's not a system that you really see elsewhere.
That's fair.
I agreed with Larry on a lot of that. I gave it a 1 in the innovative category, mostly because looking at the construction of it, I think they tried to be innovative and kind of failed. At least all of the elements of the system are things that other people have done, and in other ways that were equal to or better what they did. And I think the dice are frequently held up as the biggest aspect, and we've talked about those to death already. But, no, honestly, it was kind of hard to rate it, I think, because the elements are put together in a way that I think they wanted to be new, but just wasn't. I don't think that it really, detracted from my enjoyment, however.
So, I will say with the dice system, the fact that they put it on their own little dice itself is unique, but I've played a lot of tabletop games that do have a success-based system. Even just Escape Jurassic Park, which I played with Will before. Very simple game, and it's just based on, well, you roll an X amount of D6, and if you get X amount, it's a success. They added a few more flares into it, but it's a very simple system, in my opinion, for a tabletop game to be a success-based system. It's a good system. I like it. I like Jurassic Park. I like this. But I wouldn't call it unique just because they made some colored dice. But, I mean, once again, it is innovative to do it in that way. I just feel like that type of system has been done.
Yeah. I mean, coming from that, a lot of the other RPGs that I've seen that have used a unique dice system or a success-based dice system, they don't really go as in-depth as Fantasy Flight did with their RPGs. Usually it'll be like a D6 or like a D6 and a D10, and depending on, like, it'll either be custom symbols or it'll be like, oh, roll higher than a 4 and then you succeed, and if you roll a 3 or less you fail,
Yeah, but that going in depth in that dice system is kind of the whole issue we're having with going back and forth on, is this a good dice system or not?
I mean, it shows that just because something's innovative doesn't mean that it's a good idea.
Fair.
is really what it comes down to, is that yes, it's a little bit more of an in-depth idea than what you'd see for a success-based system, but it's also horrible.
Yeah.
I will say that obviously a lot of development went into it, and just from a cursory glance, I can tell that the mathematics behind how they determined success was very intricate here, and in a way that obscures the probabilities that they came up with from the casual player. And I think that is very interesting in and of itself for determining, like, what constitutes success. How often are you going to succeed? What's the range of possibilities? How often are they going to happen? All of that's really interesting to look at. But clearly that was a lot of the development, and it just kind of fell flat.
But I mean, seeing that level of attention to detail, and I'm glad you brought that up. I don't want to stick on the dice for much longer because we've just continually talked about them all game.
We bashed them into the ground.
But I did like I do like the concept of the dice. I think they were executed poorly, but even in execution, you can tell there was a lot of time and attention to detail to making sure it was balanced and it was thought out. It was not just thrown in there because they wanted to put dice in. And I think the decisions they made, albeit maybe not the best overall, they were made for a reason, and for that alone, I gave it a 2. You can tell these choices were made, and they were made for a reason, and they were thought out. The actions of which were not probably what they were looking for, but they were definitely thought out actions.
Honestly, the more I think about it, the less I hate the dice. I'll say that, but in the interests of getting a different conversation going, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I mean, speaking of good intentions in game design, I gave it a complex 2. I feel like they had a lot of work put into it. I liked most of it. I feel like there are definitely areas where they could improve on. Like, I really don't like skill trees. I don't. It's a personal peeve of mine. They get complicated and messy when you're working with multiple classes that each have their own individual skill tree. If you're trying to run a session like that and you have to keep those kinds of things in mind on a character, it's hard enough in D&D when the feats and everything are mostly set. It's a whole nother beast when you have 4 different classes, each with its own subclass, and each subclass has their own skill tree that can be chosen at any given point, depending on how many points you put into each tree.
Yeah.
Crazy. And you can get more trees, mind you.
Yeah.
From other classes if you want. So.
See, I like the skill tree if it was easier for it to be player governed. That's my thing. Is that, like, if I didn't have to keep track of it as the GM, I think it's awesome. It gives a lot of player agency. they're able to kind of choose their own path and they can flesh out their character, especially for people with not such a creative mind. It's a very good thing. It's just that the management of it is poorly executed. And I wouldn't expect Fantasy Flight to ship a packet of every skill tree available separately so players can mark it down. Like, put it in the book, cool, Xerox that thing, man, and just, like, hand it out to whoever wants it. But managing that is tough. So it did bring up the complexity a little bit for me.
But I think on that topic, a lot of TTRPGs that have complex sheets or anything that they expect the player to have to scan off, they put it at the back of the book where it's easy to scan.
Yeah.
This was in the center of the book. They were just like, no, you're not scanning this. You're just buying a new book. Every time you want to make a new character, that's $60 right there, baby. Got to get that bread.
Yeah, I gave it a complex 1. Honestly, I can't really remember why. But it's a complex game. It's one that you have to really devote time to learning in order to get it to function at the level of smooth that you want it to.
And for that reason, I gave it a complex 2. I feel like if you learned this game, sat down, and dedicated the time, it is entirely within grasp to understand it, play it, and be able to do it within a relatively short period of time. Yeah. 40K, I have been playing for many years, and I still am kind of fuzzy on a lot of rules. That's just not very well, thought out.
Firing from cover. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Also, I play Tau. That's all I know.
Aren't the 40K rule books kind of terrible? Just
yes.
That's a different discussion.
Yes.
I dread having to do 40K on this podcast.
That's why we'll get it done. I said just one a year. Just give me one a year.
Dude, I got so many better miniatures games. We don't have to do 40K.
I just want to play 40K.
We can tell you what, we could play 40K different time. Don't do that to these poor people.
Honestly, it'd take an entire day to do that podcast. It'd have to be 3 months of work.
Well, it's going to be 2 days just explaining what each faction specializes in, and then another 6 hours for the first round of fire.
I might just hand that one off to Will for him to recruit.
Oh, that's my job. Yeah. That's this. Edge of Empire to you. This is me. I said one a year, man.
I get one call out. This is it. Chris and Brooke are going to be livid.
All right.
So yeah,
I feel like the choices that I made didn't highlight as much how much I actually like the game. Where I gave it choices that ended up getting a 27 out of 42 for me.
That's not too far off. I ended up with a 28 out of 42.
Yeah, oddly enough, I ended up with a 27 out of 42. Despite how highly I praise this game, when I actually look at the breakdown, it scores a lot lower than I expected it to.
I gave it a 30 overall. I feel like I put a lot of personal thought into things like recommendation and everything. Yeah. As far as a score, though, 30 is really not bad. Yeah. Like, that's definitely like a B. Yeah. I know it sounds low because it's less than a quarter off the highest score. I've never seen a game get a 40.
No.
But yeah, as far as closing comments go, as low as this scored, it's still a game that I love. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds like our overall score is a 28, which really does put it up there with some of the best games we've graded, honestly. One day maybe we'll find the perfect game, but I very much doubt it.
Well, if we did, we'd never stop playing it.
Yeah. The grading system is meant to be more reminiscent of the scores that lead up to it as opposed to the total score.
Yeah.
Of course, everyone always likes to get that perfect game, but
nobody does.
No.
It'd be really hard to do. Some of these categories are like mutually exclusive almost.
Yeah. They kind of are. We're not good at making rubrics.
Like, this is the simplest game ever that is also the most complex game ever that has infinite replay value, but is so simple.
Crazy Eights.
It takes no setup.
Crazy Eights.
It takes no setup except for reading 800 pages of monotonous lore that you may or may not be interested in. But other than that, you just jump right in and go.
I mean, but I
there are 8-page TTRPG books.
Yeah, I know, and they're horrible for the most part.
Hey,
for the most part,
I
okay.
don't know, Crash Pandas was fun.
Listen, man, I'm still personally butthurt over the Sea of Thieves tabletop RPG.
Sea of Thieves is bad,
Wait,
just in
what?
general.
Listen, the game itself is wonderful, and
It's
I'm
alright.
don't make me hijack
It's
your
not a-
podcast. I've played that game for 5 years.
We
Don't
are
do this to me.
I played that game
Alright.
for years too.
I'm
I
going to
learned
say
to
that
play the
maybe we
hurdy-gurdy
should,
because of that game. Like,
I am a pirate at heart. Don't do this to me.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Dancing with the Bards. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to follow us on social media. You can find us at Dance with Bards on Twitter. And don't forget to follow us on with Bards on Twitch to join us for Sunday streams. And don't forget, may the 4th be with you.
Dun, 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 dun.